Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this official virtual side event at the UN Ocean Conference, taking place this week in Lisbon. The event will take place in English, but you can listen in French or Spanish by choosing the correct interpretation channel. Click on the little globe in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen to do this. We aim to have a little time at the end for questions. To make this easy for our moderator, please put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. You can also upvote the questions you are most interested in using the like function in the Q&A. On behalf of Stop Ecocide International, I'd like to thank our co-hosts, the People's Republic of Bangladesh, the Republic of Vanuatu, and the independent state of Samoa. I'd also like to thank our event partners, Stop Ecocide Foundation, Gallifrey Foundation, Global Choices, Mana Pacific, the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and Sea Wilding. It's wonderful to work with you all. It's now my privilege to introduce our chair and moderator for today, former UN Ambassador Amanda Ellis. Amanda is Asia Pacific Executive Director of the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation and Senior Director of Global Partnerships and Networks for the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. She is co-chair of the We Empower UN SDG Challenge, launched by the UN Secretary General, President of the World Bank, and the Council of Women World Leaders in 2018 to promote inclusive entrepreneurship. Previous roles include New Zealand's Head of Mission and Ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, Inaugural Ambassador for Women and Girls, and Prime Minister's Special Envoy to Francophone Africa. Amanda, I hand over to you for the chairing of this event.
Well, aloha everybody and bonjour from Paris. It's such a privilege and an honor to be here today for this critical event with such a fabulous group of panelists. I wanted to begin by echoing Jojo and thanking the state co-hosts of today's event. We're going to start with a special message from the esteemed representative of Bangladesh, Mr. Saber Hossain Chowdhury, with whom I have the privilege of being very recently in Baku together. The chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee of the Ministry of the Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and the MP who has played a critical role in the climate change agenda for Bangladesh.
Greetings to everyone from Dhaka, Bangladesh. We come to this conversation with a sense of immediate urgency. Whilst Bangladesh is one of the states least responsible for the climate crisis, this crisis is already an existential issue for us. Bangladesh is one of the planet's most vulnerable countries, where a potential 1 meter rise of sea level will displace 40 million citizens. These effects are already being felt in droughts, flooding, extreme weather, salinity intrusion, and threats to food security. In our parliament, a motion was adopted declaring a planetary emergency, and our constitution has recently gained a new article 18A, which addresses protection and preservation of natural resources, wetlands, forests, biodiversity for current and future citizens. Bangladesh is of course committed to the UNFCCC processes, but the slow pace of action emerging from these processes is proving to be deeply concerning. Therefore, Bangladesh is fully committed to exploring parallel avenues to assist in driving action to curb and mitigate climate change and establish a harmonious relationship with nature. Laws to deter the worst harms to ecosystems, especially those ecosystems which are crucial for stabilizing climate, are therefore of great interest to us. Bangladesh is home to some of these crucial and critical ecosystems. For example, the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove ecosystem. But our interest extends beyond our borders, as the protection of key carbon sinks worldwide has a direct impact on Bangladesh, and hence consideration of the role of international criminal law in this context is of significant interest. Bangladesh has been examining the possibilities for including recognition of severe environmental harms or ecocide in our own domestic legislation, and we are pleased to support this important ongoing conversation at the international level. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have a recorded audio message from Christopher Bartlett, who is at the conference and unable to join on video. He is the Climate Diplomacy Manager at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Vanuatu.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Lisbon in Portugal. Vanuatu is extremely pleased to co-host this event with Bangladesh and Samoa and lend our leadership to the growing movement towards criminalizing ecocide. As one of the most vulnerable nations, Vanuatu and our people are out of time, and we are now experiencing excruciating impacts of climate change and environmental destruction for which we are not responsible. Right now, the land of our island villages is being lost to insidious sea level rise. Right now, increasing ocean acidification is taking away forever our life-giving coral reefs. And right now, our own government is being held accountable to address the human rights violations of still unremedied Category 5 cyclone impacts that erased our GDP in a matter of hours, distinguished livelihoods, and took away our people's lives. In response, on the 27th of May of this year, our parliament endorsed the declaration of climate emergency, including our commitment to leave no stone unturned as we address the existential climate crisis. We, along with other developing nations, are demanding increased ambition to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as you are probably aware, Vanuatu has committed to bringing the issue of climate change to the International Court of Justice. And alongside a coalition of nations, we will ask members of the UN General Assembly this year to vote in support of a resolution that requests the ICJ to provide an advisory opinion on the obligations of states under international law to protect the rights of present and future generations against the adverse effects of climate change. And of course, our country has been a key government voice in the push to criminalize ecocide, having formally tabled this at the 18th Assembly of State Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Our ecocide leadership is a given, considering the destruction of ecosystems is both a cause and an exacerbating factor for the destabilization of the climate. And of course, as one of the world's great ocean states, Vanuatu is right now here at the UN Oceans Conference in Lisbon, and we continue to push all nations to take responsibility for addressing climate change and assure that accountability and justice is in all spaces. And with this, Vanuatu wishes all participants here in this event fruitful discussions, and we look forward to concrete outcomes that bring us closer to criminalizing ecocide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. So important, those key points. And those who are least those responsible are the most impacted, which is why this initiative is critical. Christopher mentioned the International Court of Justice initiative, and of course, Ecocide goes a step further to the International Criminal Court. So it's now my very great pleasure to introduce the incredible Jojo Mehta, who is the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. Jojo has overseen the remarkable growth of the global movement to criminalize ecocide, and she's done an amazing job coordinating between legal developments, diplomatic communication, and public narratives. Jojo is chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation, and she's the convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. Jojo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we are living in a time when our level of knowledge about the world, and specifically about oceans, is higher and more detailed than ever before. We know that billions of people depend upon healthy oceans for food, and that multiple millions in coastal communities depend upon them for their livelihoods. We know how much ocean ecosystems contribute to climate stability, and how the delicate balance of acidity can affect that contribution. We also know that severe collateral damage of industrial activities, some of which already breaches existing regulation, continues to affect marine ecosystems with impunity, and that new extractive projects are being planned which will further threaten these ecosystems. We would suggest that this situation results inevitably from the deeply ingrained mindset we have in our dominant Western systems, a mindset developed over centuries, a mindset of separating ourselves from the living world upon which we depend for our food, our water, the air we breathe. We simply take these things for granted and treat them as an infinite bank of resources, continuing to inflict levels of destruction which will directly affect our ability to survive and thrive on our planetary home. Now, we all know you can't apply for a license to kill people for your new business. It would be both criminal and criminally insane. But we don't recoil in the same way from destroying nature, and we should, for very practical reasons. Removal of carbon sinks and keystone species, for example, via illegal fishing, poaching, and trafficking, as well as severe marine pollution, all exacerbate ecosystem collapse and climate change. Existing international law governing the marine environment, as set out in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, focuses as much or more on rights of economic exploitation as it does on enforceable protective measures. And so criminal law could be of great help here. Making ecocide, severe and either widespread or long-term harm to nature, a crime, could provide the legal guardrail to steer us back from the precipice by setting a clear outer boundary to deter, prevent, and sanction the worst threats to ecosystems and endangered keystone species. There is a clear gap here. If you advocate around human rights, at least you know that the worst violations, torture, forced displacement, mass murder, are recognized as deeply serious crimes. There is a deep moral and legal foundation to your advocacy at the global level. That foundational piece is conspicuously missing in the environmental arena, and it's a gap that is rapidly becoming a chasm into which vulnerable and vital ecosystems and keystone species and communities dependent upon them are already falling. Recognizing ecocide as an international crime alongside war crimes and genocide has the potential to fill that gap, strengthening and shoring up existing laws, while at the same time shifting norms to recognize the simple fact of humanity's dependence upon healthy ecosystems for our own survival. Moreover, putting this kind of outer boundary framework in place also serves to stimulate strategic change in the right direction, something that has hitherto been proving very difficult. We are indeed witnessing a rising frustration at all levels with the failure to actually implement the multilateral environmental agreements and pledges which already exist. And we heard that in the heartfelt contribution of Christopher Bartlett. We human beings are creatures of habit, and industrial practice tends not to change without a change in the rules, particularly when fiduciary duties lead corporate decision makers to prioritize profit as a matter of obligation. The correct criminal law parameters can act as a kind of creative constraint, provoking the urgent new thinking and innovation that we already know is needed. And all of this helps to explain the growing demand for international recognition of ecocide, now coming from voices as diverse as the global youth movement on the one hand, who made it their primary demand at the recent Stockholm Plus 50 UN Environment meeting, to the global investment community on the other, the International Corporate Governance Network, an investor-led network of banks and financial firms responsible for over half the world's managed assets, recently recommended governments specifically to collaborate on criminalising ecocide. An important milestone in this initiative was reached last year when an independent panel of legal experts from around the world, convened by our foundation, reached consensus on a legal definition of ecocide as a proposed international crime in 2021. The core text is concise and balanced, and you can see it in the chat right now. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. This definition has gained significant political traction around the world, while the European Law Institute is working on a related EU-specific definition, and ecocide is also being discussed in the context of revising the EU Environmental Crime Directive. Individual states are also considering recognition of ecocide. Belgium has recently recommended its inclusion in the revision of their criminal code, with a definition very closely based on the one just shown in the chat. Indeed, conversation around this is now on public record at parliamentary and/or government level in no fewer than 23 states, which are parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The most recent country to join this number is Kenya, co-host of the present Ocean Conference, whose Cabinet Secretary for the Environment and Forests, Mr. Keriako Tobiko, announced right here in the conference plenary this week that the Kenyan government will be proposing key revisions of their Environment Management Coordination Act to include, inter alia, protection for environmental defenders and recognition of a crime of ecocide. Our organisation continues to work to develop global cross-sector support for this recognition at all levels, from grassroots to NGOs, from policymakers to the private sector, and of course at UN level, in the context of the UNFCCC, the CBD, UNEA, and of course here in Lisbon at the Ocean Conference. And I look forward to hearing through the presentations in today's event how relevant to many different ocean contexts this criminal law framework could truly be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jojo. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And it's incredible to see how much support you have been able to garner from groups as different as the youth movement and the investment community. So congratulations on your foresight and your grit and determination in really bringing this issue to the forefront. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Antoinette Vermillier, who is the co-founder of the Gallifrey Foundation, and She Changes Climate. Antoinette is absolutely passionate about the complex interrelationships of the ocean, gender, plastics and overfishing, on social justice, human health, and the environment. And she's one of the most brilliant people I know. Antoinette seeks to find coalitions for action-oriented solutions, and she's also very good at focusing on the far-reaching impacts downstream and taking action on identified gaps where little or no attention is being paid. So Antoinette describes her work as eclectic interconnectedness, which I think is a wonderful phrase, eclectic interconnectedness. And that's what all of us here represent today, with the oceans as our central theme. Ranging from the impact of overfishing on the ocean and migrants, empowering citizens to take civil legal action against unsustainable legal and illegal overfishing, awareness campaigns on the impacts of plastics on human and planetary health, social injustice, and the environment. Antoinette, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that lovely introduction. And also thank you, Jojo, for this wonderful opportunity to speak today. I am such a supporter of Stop Ecocide. But what I would like to do is go to my slide presentation, please, and explain what happened before I knew of Stop Ecocide and why it's going to be so important. So I'm taking you back about 2 or 3 years ago. This is a picture around the Galapagos Islands that, thanks to Global Fishing Watch, in August 2022, published this image from satellite space looking down around the Galapagos Islands. And those little white dots are actually turned out to be about 350 squid jiggers from Chinese registered vessels that were literally all the way around an area which we know is of really important biodiversity. In addition, you can see on this image that there is a corridor between the Ecuador coastline and the Galapagos EEZs, which became a swimway where it's very easy just to capture whatever creatures were migrating. Of course, my reaction was, well, you know, how can this happen? And then I started thinking about, and this is where it relates to the ecocide, the quantity of what was being extracted at such a scale. And then I started thinking about, wow, the impact of this extraction on the marine wildlife that is living there. What, you know, surely something must be done. I mean, surely this can't be legal. Fortunately, I then learned that much of this is absolutely legal. If I could go to the next slide, please. So just a bit of background if you are not totally involved in the fishing world. I learned that we are emptying the ocean of all life and that the current legal system is built for a different rate of fishing. We are on the high seas, we're able almost to fish 24/7, 360 days of the year with few limits. And I'll explain that later. What would be interesting to note is that we calculated we extract the weight of the Chinese population annually in fish. If we look at this, we're just not treating our oceans properly. And this example in the Galapagos really served to highlight it. On these images, shark finning has increased exponentially. We are now finning up to 100 million sharks a year. And as a result of that, the IUCN declared last year that at least a third of sharks and rays are facing near or almost extinction. Our bottom trawling continues, and that is legal. And that was last year. They discovered, Enric Sala in a report indicated that it releases more greenhouse gas emissions than even the country of Germany or aviation. The bottom line is we're not treating our high seas or our oceans properly, and the regulations within them are somewhat different. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what we need to understand here is this is exacerbated by such things as harmful fishing subsidies, which thankfully last week are en route to being curtailed. But, you know, we have things like certain species that are not even regulated. So therefore, without any regulation or any accountability, it's basically ad infinitum until they're no longer there. We have such legal destructive fishing practices, such as bottom trawling, where we are literally destroying the entire habitats of all sorts of creatures just to target one creature. I think in the end, what the other areas, and this is where I went down a rabbit hole, I convened a group of experts and I asked, what could we do as a civilian? Because it's always, well, what you do, don't eat fish. And I thought, is there a way we can galvanize this public indignation to action? And in fact, what turned out is we looked at certain things. There's the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which is to maintain fishing capacity at levels of sustainable use of stocks. Well, that's clearly not happening. We have a UN FAO Code of Conduct for responsible fisheries. These are not being applied. So this goes back to the fact that we need a stronger lever. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here, this is what I learned as someone who was entering this rather naively, is the sea is cut up pretty much like we cut up, the butcher cuts up cows. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is how the water on our ocean and seas are divided. So if you if you try and regulate for one area, in another area that doesn't apply. And it can be seasonal, or it can be based on species, or it can be based on whether it's on the seabed, or whether it is covered by a certain body. As a result, you can understand this is almost nightmarish to be able to find a way that when you step back at 30,000 feet and realize that 90% of our big fish have gone due to overfishing, that we are now chasing the bottom of the barrel. And this is really a race to the bottom in the worst sense of the word. Could we please move to the next slide? The other part I realized is that whilst we may also have all of these areas that are covered in a patchwork of regulations, this dark blue area is the high seas. And at the moment, that's probably one of the most vulnerable areas. And it's a bit like I always think of, you know, what Las Vegas, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, what happens in the high seas, it does, we don't see it. We have a massive amount of illegal fishing because no one can monitoring them, unreported. Transshipping takes place, although that's illegal. Refueling, although that's legal. Finning and other species that are extracted. And again, we have no monitoring. So what happened was after this meeting, I came up sort of like, my gosh, this is terrible. If I could go to the next slide, please. That's a colander, and it's basically to show it's not very effective at holding water. And I feel very much that the current legal systems, if they're not properly and properly applied as they were meant to be, we're finding ourselves with a very imperfect system and a very imperfect system of enforcement. So without knowing Jojo at the time, which I wish I did, we decided to try something a little bit a creative tangential legal action. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And we decided to look at, instead of looking at the UN system of the law of the sea, was to take each country, look at their constitution and see if there were creative legal tangential ways in which to at least slow down the whole fishing and overfishing scenarios. And the thing is that we need to understand is that each country, some of them have in their constitutions articles that allow us to do this. So we began by empowering citizens from around the world, first of all, to sign an open letter to governments to ask them to take better care of the ocean. But we coupled this with a legal action. And that legal action was basically to submit an injunction. We started with Argentina, and if we could go to the next slide, please. And the aim was to generate reaction. And our feeling was that the current paradigms of state of affairs were very static. And although there's a lot going on, there wasn't enough of a push to create the reactions that we wanted. So our aim was, we basically sued the Argentinian government and said that you're not doing enough to protect your people for a right to sustainable living, which is under Article 14 of their national constitution. But the point about that, and this is what I'm what we tried to do, is we wanted to empower the general public to be able to take something and take it upwards. They could show that they really wanted to do something other than just not eat fish, because although I would love that to be the case, the practical part, it's not going to always happen. The second part was to work with other NGOs and environmental organizations. So how could we be the good cop? How we would be the bad cop, they would be the good cop. We could leverage that so that they could actually talk to governments and say, to get these people off your back, if you did X, Y, and Z, this might be helpful. So we're a useful lever as an antagonist for other groups to work in order to move dialogues forwards. The same thing happened for national governments. What we wanted to do there is to create a dialogue that would help them, a tool to help them to reach out to other international bodies in order to say, look, these people are on our back, we've got pressure, we have to go out to you. So we were kind of like the sting, the bee sting that was generating a lot of buzz. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I should have said it in my previous slide, we had flat water. Well, our aim is to be the rock that goes in the water and creates ripples that changes action, reaction. And so in our case, we had a number of signatures for the open letter. We also did get a lot of traction with other organizations who could leverage us to go up to their national government and say, you know, this is what is happening. As regards the national government in Argentina, there was an election last year, and that turned out to be very interesting because our case was leveraged for change for good. And then in the international areas, we did end up having quite a lot of reaction from many of the countries that we blatantly accused of, well, actually we cited all the IUUs and other infractions that we had come across over the last 10 years. So the point about this was, what we have actually done is created an engine to create movement, and we hope it is in the positive direction. And what we're trying to do is hope that those ripples aid everyone as a tool to improve better management of the ocean and of the marine wildlife within it. If we could go to the next slide, please. So finally, what I just want to say is that if we had had, or if I had known, and if the Ecocide law was in place right now, what I am seeing with these, the looming possibility of Ecocide gaining traction, this is already causing reaction. It is causing governments, industry, fisheries, everyone to really think about this. At the end of the day, if we go back to my first slide, this is Ecocide. We are literally killing everything that is in the ocean. We're killing it at a rate that it cannot recover right now. And we really need, we're talking at this Oceans Conference about action. We really need action. We really need something like Ecocide, because these are going to be the levers that will help us legally apply the pressure to contain this wanton abandonment of illegal and legal overfishing on the oceans. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you, Antoinette. And you've done such a wonderful job of setting out the tragedy of the global commons, a race to the bottom indeed. And I remember just being so appalled when I discovered that the CO2 emitted from bottom trawling, over and above the dreadful damage done to the seafloor with bycatch, all the rest of it, is more than the country of Germany and more than global air emissions. So this is such a complex, multifaceted problem. And as you so eloquently said, absolutely critical to have the kind of legal guardrails that Ecocide will provide. Thank you so much again, Antoinette. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Persis Birimoria. And Persis is a visiting associate at the Cambridge Centre for Climate Repair, with, of course, the brilliant Sir David King, who served as Tony Blair's chief science advisor. Persis is the founder and chief executive of an incredibly exciting company, Earth Soul India Private Limited, which is India's first compostable and biodegradable product manufacturer. So important in the context of oceans. Persis sits on the Standards Committee for the Bureau of Indian Standards, with special reference to biopolymers from renewable resources in India. Recently appointed as an advisory committee member of the International Biochar Initiative, where we at the Global Futures Lab at ASU are also active, and is chairman of the Converging World. Persis has been involved with climate change research since 2001, so over 20 years, and more recently has been a part of a range of climate change sustainability conferences held globally. Persis, we're delighted to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Amanda, and thank you, Jojo, for letting me in on this very important oceans session from the UN. Now, I've often wondered and queried which is the best way to make us humans understand our relationship with nature. And I thought one of the ways to do this is to relate our organs, like the heart, the kidney, the liver of our living organs, with parts of the Earth ecosystem. I look at the oceans because they constitute more than 70% of our Earth's landmass, the total mass. And I look at the oceans as being our heart. And what I see happening is an extensive damage to almost all the arteries that are responsible for pumping blood into the entire human systems. It's the same that's happening with nature. If you will notice, there's 50% of the oxygen we breathe is produced by the oceans. They regulate the climate in terms of, there's a system called the Atlantic Meridional Current, the AMOC, which ensures that there's heat transported all around the world from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Then there's the transportation systems, there's food, there's livelihoods, there's just about everything that one can dream of that lies within the oceans. And it's the resource system for the entire planet, basically. Next, please. So just looking at the food chain, it's important to understand that there are projections that around 2048, there will be no more harvestable wild fish in our oceans. Now, you can imagine not just the impacts in terms of food, but in terms of livelihoods for communities all around the world. It's a cheap source for nearly 2 to 3 billion. That's almost half the population of the world for protein. It's an essential format to ensure that corals thrive and the whole ecosystem flourishes. Now, the problem is that our oceans are becoming so acidic that the very sense of life and livelihood is being endangered, which I think is an enormous threat to mankind. Slide 4, please. We've now talking about deep sea mining, and it brings to my mind the fact that we've ravaged most of our forests. The Amazon is from a sink of CO2 has now become a source for CO2. We are now engaging with damaging our oceans, which take up 90%. Our surface layers of the oceans absorb 90% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. We're looking to damage that as well. And I can't understand where this degradation is really going to cease and stop. So, next slide, please. The impacts of deep sea mining, the next slide, please. This is what it does. It will destroy the natural seabed landforms that we've been used to for billions and millions of years. And what happens is that when you go to do deep sea mining, you actually remove what are known as polymetallic nodules. Now, these nodules are essential for minerals like lithium, magnesium, manganese, chlorides, which are basically, and cobalts, which are important for our mobile phones, electric vehicles, and a whole host of implements. Next slide, please. So this gives you an idea of exactly what deep sea mining entails. It's early days. Per se, one should not put away new technology, but I think new technology comes with a lot of validation and certification. And I think it's so important that we understand the impacts of what we are heading into. Next slide, please. So these are the polymetallic nodules which lie on the seabed. There's a zone between Hawaii and Mexico, which is known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, CCZ, which has enough nickel and cobalt in nodule form to create 4.8 billion electric battery vehicles. I mean, batteries for electric vehicles. Now, that's a huge amount. But when you go to do this, it's equivalent of vacuuming up golf balls from the bottom of a lake, which is disastrous, absolutely. Next slide, please. This is just what I've explained and mentioned earlier. So as I've mentioned, I think it's very important to understand that human beings and nature need to coexist. We have this great business as usual mantra, which says that, you know, we will carry on doing as we've done. Natural resources are finite, but in terms of business, they are infinite. I have another fix. I have another fix to this. I say that why can't we mimic nature without transgressing natural habitats? I think that would be one format. Next slide, please. So the question mark is that there is no human ingenuity is infinite completely. We know natural resources are finite. I think the single biggest challenge that we have as human beings on our planet is to try and integrate infinite human ingenuity with natural resources being finite. And I think if that can be done, and if we can achieve a balance between the two, mankind has some hope going into the future. But I believe that one has to, the United Nations Secretary General just mentioned that there's an emergency. I think it's greater than that. I think we're all in the ICU as we speak. For those who've experienced the ICU, I dread to know what that feels like. But I think it's so important for each of us to realize that human beings and nature have to coexist. And I think for this, if we can't understand this, I think laws like Ecocide need to be put into place, because that is the only other understanding that we human beings will have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Persis. And I think your point about us being on a finite planet and yet behaving as though it's infinite are so well taken. And the fact that you yourself have actually been, as you counsel us, finding ways to mimic nature without actually going beyond the limits. So I'm very grateful to you for that note of hope. Yes, we are in the ICU, but to see business people like you actually walking the walk and showing us how you can actually create in a different way. We do need to remember too that, as you pointed out, 90% of the additional heat created by the extra CO2 in the atmosphere has been taken up by the oceans, and there is such a critical role. So thank you very much for your presentation and those timely reminders and that little note of hope for us. So I'm now delighted to move to our next speaker, Inge Ralph, who has just an extraordinary background. She's the executive director and the co-founder of Global Choices, which is a female-led and genuinely intergenerational not-for-profit, which prioritizes protection of the Central Arctic Ocean. And of course, this is absolutely the part of the planet where we are seeing the most impact right now in terms of endangering our climate systems. Inge advocates for reframing the ice shield as a global commons, and as an economist, I could not agree more. She is calling for a 10-year moratorium to protect it. As we know, losing the ice is already having global repercussions. Inge believes legal challenges like the Ecocide law will indeed be critical if it is to be protected in time to save this unique biome. Inge is known for her thought leadership and policy innovation around systems change, global governance, peace and security, and she was senior policy advisor to the elders during the landmark Paris COP and the SDG agreements. Prior to that, executive roles in business and founded a number of international NGOs. So Inge, you should be about 150 with all that you've done. And we know that you have a lifelong passion for climate justice and human rights. The floor.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I mean, it's been a busy week. I kind of feel 150, frankly, with lack of sleep. But, and thank you, Jojo, for convening this and for the invitation. I mean, it couldn't come at a better time. Here we are in Lisbon, and just hearing about how much degradation there is of the oceans and nature. And, you know, we have to understand that it's not just areas and species that need protection and activities, but whole systems. And none of those systems, as you said in your intro, is more critical than the poles, because the poles, and particularly the Arctic, they are warming 3 to 4 times faster than anywhere else on Earth. And why is it so critical? Well, it's obvious, because when we lose that ice, which is the regulator of the planet and the thermostat of the planet, there is virtually no recovery. If we don't keep under 1.5 and we lose it, it won't be there for our lifetime. And what it causes is so critical. I mean, the impacts are massive. So because it acts as this regulator, we will have cascade effects. And whilst, of course, at the moment, the focus is very much around the contiguous states and the Arctic itself, and there are 4 million people living there. But you could argue that, Sami is affected, but even more so will be Samoa, and as we heard, Bangladesh, sea level rise, Vanuatu will be underwater. So we're saying we have to really reframe this whole thing, and not just, it worked fine, and the Arctic Council did a grand job and is doing a grand job, frankly, while it was all frozen. But now there are so many interesting interests, commercial interests, particularly, as we've just heard, deep seabed mining, these nodules, oil and gas. How about having a transpolar shipping route so we can ship LNG faster across the poles, right? So these threats are real, and commerce, I mean, $70 trillion is poised to go into that space. So governance generally tends to be retrospective. And we're saying we have to be proactive and create future fit governance. And that's where I think, what you're doing with Ecocide is exactly spot on. So imagine this as a global commons. Imagine that we can expand the governance of these spaces. And bear in mind, this is not the only system that is missing global governance. Most of our global systems miss global governance. So that's a huge gap that has to be filled. And involving Indigenous communities, involving a much broader constituency of those who are affected, and they should have a say. And we are advocating this 10-year moratorium. Let's have a precautionary principle pause, where science has to catch up for a start. I mean, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about, what's under the ice. And just protect it. I mean, it's a bit like, saying, well, let's plant trees, but let's cut down the Amazon at the same time. We're saying we have to do both. We have to keep under 1.5, but we also have to protect what we have. And to do that, we aren't going to be able to rely on the treaty process, to be honest. I mean, the ice will have melted by the time you get all of that agreement. It's a massively challenging thing, particularly in a world where multilateralism is coming apart. So we would say, let's use things like Ecocide and legal challenges in order to get this in place. And let's also use this moral imperative, because I think we're now at a different place where we understand that we have a moral imperative to protect this. And I think, the combination of current legal precedents that are being set and Ecocide would scare the life out of a lot of the boardrooms, frankly, who are poised to move into this space, and really make them think twice about doing so. So, that to me is the critical element of it. Then there's also another piece of how do we do this? So for us, it's about actually involving civil society and a genuine intergenerational response, because we have too much of this divide where the young people are saying, oh, well, you've caused all the problem. And it's always somebody else who's caused all the problem. And, there are victims involved. And of course, there are victims. But we're not going to resolve this with that type of mindset. We have to really move into the idea that we are collectively have to set ego aside for the common good. And so that's an area that we work in a lot. We work with young people and getting young people behind these ideas. And first of all, understanding the science, but then also understanding the remedies and the potential remedies. Then it's also educating policymakers, because it's remarkable how little the Arctic is understood as an apex system. So bringing in policymakers is also crucial. And then bringing in, and it's where we can work collaboratively by bringing in the ideas of Ecocide and sharing those ideas. And I think the Arctic is a particularly good model for this, because it's not territorial, it's an area beyond national jurisdiction. But here's an interesting thing. So we've got, and it's governed by the UN Law of the Sea, and it has all these problems that Antoinette mentioned, where you've got multiple legal systems that undermine one another. So the Deep Seabed Mining Authority will give permission. The Intercontinental Shelf will literally undermine, and there are claims right up to the North Pole, even though it's within an area beyond national jurisdiction. So trying to work your way through that, again, is a total minefield. And that's where I think Ecocide bridges a lot of this, to be able to say, this is a primary criminal offense to harm this space, because you're not only harming the physical space, but you're harming mankind or humankind. And so the causality is a massive issue, I think, that one can very clearly, science is beginning to prove. And then there is another piece, and if we could move on to the slide of Robert Swan. And I just love this, and we had two young people we sponsored to go down to Antarctica, because of course that's also connected. It is this sort of circulatory system, and it is what I would see as the heart and the lungs of the planet. They went with Robert Swan to Antarctica, and just were transformed by understanding the awe of these places. It's not just, it's so easy to get sort of drawn into policy and into legalities and into the technicalities, and forgetting just this incredible awe of nature. And the fact that you have this ice sitting on top and tail of the earth, cooling and regulating and doing its job, and that we would really harm it, and the 21,000 species that live in those spaces. So it's also important to be able to bring visually this beauty of this place. But I think we also need to look at self-governance. There is this notion that it's someone else's problem, but we are all part of this planet. And therefore, how can we think about our own actions? If you consider that 1 ton of carbon melts 3 meters square of ice. So if you take a trip from London to New York, you've lost 6 meters square of ice. So if we look at our own self-governance, and I know we have to look at the big systems and all the rest, but we also have this part to play, and never underestimate how important that is and how we can share these things. So thank you again. And it can't come fast enough. I mean, that is the big issue for us, is the speed, because it's estimated we've probably got 10 years before we have an ice-free summer in the Arctic. And we can't wait. So thank you.
Thank you, Inga. Such important points. And to remind everybody that this is indeed the decisive decade, as Ocean's icon Sylvia Earle, co-chair of Mission Blue, points out. This decade in which we are living now will be the most consequential for the next 10,000. So this is really the time for action, for speed and scale. And as you point out, governments really need to be proactive. Love this idea of the Arctic as an apex system. We're all very familiar of the idea of the apex predator. The Arctic as the apex system for the planet makes so much sense. And your framing of ecocide as a moral imperative is such an important one. On a personal note, I was just with Robert Swan a few days ago at the Vila Institute in Switzerland, and he was with Jade Hameister from Australia, who is the youngest person to have gone to both poles. It started at age 14. And to hear both of them talk about the wonder, the awe, the majesty is just breathtaking. So absolutely critical to be protecting the Arctic and to be thinking about our planetary systems as interconnected planetary systems whose boundaries we are indeed transgressing. Thank you so much, Inga. And now we're going to move to John Miller, who is from Hawaii, where I am normally resident. John is the co-founder and president of Monastery Experience in the Pacific, in isolated and high-risk regions. John is skilled in strategic planning, transformative business models, international business and logistics, entrepreneurship, and utility project development and financing. Now, John was actually mentored by Samoan Utu Abemalai, who was the executive director of the Samoa Power Authority, working to combat critical environmental challenges in American Samoa and Greater Polynesian. And I love the fact, John, that you mentioned that in your bio, and that is such an important relationship for you. Thank you. The floor is yours, John.
Thank you, Amanda, for the introduction as well. It's always great to see one of our most beloved Keiki Okana from Hawaii. Good to see you. And thank you, Jojo, of course, for inviting me to be a part of this critical conversation. And on that part, Amanda, I'd like to take this moment before I get started my presentation to give tribute to the late High Chief Utu Abemalai from Samoa, as well as, unfortunately, the late passing of the late Pono Shim from Hawaii, and all of the professional and indigenous elders that have taught me and inspired me along this journey. But after that, let's get started. As Amanda said, I'm the president and co-founder of Mana Pacific. You can get next slide. And this will just give some context of what we're doing and for this conversation. But Mana Pacific, we deliver resilient and renewable energy solutions for the Pacific Island nations. And our goal is accelerating the adoption of clean energy across the Pacific using our expert certified Mana Pledge. And the Mana Pledge uses efforts that are aligned and coordinated with the island renewable energy goals, as well as the climate change goals, local island government infrastructure goals, and of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. And Mana Pacific is a for-profit entity, but we are a benefit corporation, which means we balance the 3 Ps. So our fiduciary responsibility of our board members are to make sure we balance properly people, planet, and profit, or as we like to say oftentimes, prosperity. And that's the people that work for our company, but more importantly, the people and communities that we serve, taking care of the planet, of course, renewable energy, but also making sure the supply chains and everything else is in accordance with best practices for climate mitigation. And then profit, we want to make sure we provide good shareholder profits to our shareholders, but also make sure we provide prosperity to the communities that we serve. And this is based on the Patagonia model. Perfect, next slide, yep. And so the problems that we solve is, unfortunately, there's various problems that's plagued the Pacific Islands for decades. And now, unfortunately, the rest of the world is starting to see with the energy crisis caused by the conflict in Ukraine is the global insecurity or energy insecurity. And so the islands are dependent on international sources of fossil fuels. And we're unfortunately, those are very expensive fossil fuels. And so these high and volatile prices dampers our economic development and stresses our government budgets. And of course, these fossil fuels, produce negative climate change effects and environmental impacts. And the Pacific Islands are notoriously difficult to provide investments for because the Pacific Islands are oftentimes very small and we don't have very large negotiating power. So as a Pacific Island nation looking for attractive pricing or investments, we're oftentimes smaller than a city in the rest of the world. So one of the things we're trying to do is address that with the Mana Pledge. Additionally, one of the things that makes it very difficult is right now, even though renewable energy in the Pacific Islands is cheaper than the use of fossil fuels, right now, even as record prices are in fossil fuels across the globe, fossil fuel companies are bringing in record profits. And so investors are obviously very attracted to business as usual, record profits, and of course, our unique communities, which are the least responsible for the climate crisis and rising seas, are having trouble attract that financing. And so that's why we basically brought together the Mana Pledge, which basically unites the islands together on a commonalities. While we have unique differences culturally, economic and legal differences, we have a commonality to address the climate crisis and perverse economic development. And so that brings us to the Mana Pledge. On the next slide. And so our goal is basically uniting the Pacific Islands on those commonalities and bringing a non-binding compact together on those commonalities. And by doing so, we can create a market that's as large as $57 billion buying market. And the goal is by taking these islands together, we can then bring this package to hopefully COP27 and additional COPs and start to unlock some of that climate finance that's been allocated, earmarked, and promised for the least developed nations, as well as those that have been least responsible for the rising sea levels and, as we like to say, on the front lines of the climate crisis. Next slide. And just recently at our Oceans Conference, discussing these different matters and how the ocean economies deal with renewable energy, President Whips hosted 80 countries in Palau. And during that time, Palau was the initial signatory and leading the Mana Pledge. and also committed to committed to 100% renewable energy by 2032. And the goal is over the next couple of months, we're going to be working with different Pacific Islands, including Micronesia, and then soon have been discussions with Pacific Islands Forum, discuss bringing on additional Pacific Islands before we go to COP27. Next slide. And so here's where the intersection comes between, for us, Ecocide and our efforts in the Pacific Islands, is we believe, or I believe, developers play one of the most important roles alongside investors in addressing and prioritizing community needs and interests in developing of local projects. Unfortunately, most investors are unaware of the local sensitivities of the community and rely on developers to be transparent. And we see this in Hawaii. Oftentimes, investors come out here and don't understand the friction points that happen in our communities in Hawaii until they actually immerse themselves. And unfortunately, many of these investors sit in large boardrooms in London and New York City and Hong Kong and around the world and don't understand our needs or communities. And so often these developers, investors also prioritize profits over local community interests. And to be fair, other times investors are simply unaware of these extreme sensitive risks that face our communities. And so this is where I strongly believe that laws like Ecocide can become the moral and ethical compass for our investors, evaluating investments like fossil fuels or deep sea mining that can lead to the widespread and long-term damage to the environment. And so I believe by making environmentally extractive and damaging projects like these fossil fuel projects too risky for investors, it can stop them at inception before they gain momentum. And more importantly, I think with the climate crisis, divert those investments to where they're needed most, in communities like Africa and the Pacific Islands, or islands around the world that are facing and on the front lines of climate crisis. Next slide. Another point that was brought up before, I'd like to just reiterate, is the fact that, the Pacific Islands, are vanishing. And these aren't just our islands. This is our cultures, our traditions, our histories, and our homes that are vanishing if we don't take timely action. And these islands here on the left are just a few, from the Maldives, Kiribati, Palau, and Solomon Islands, and Samoa. But unfortunately, the United Nations has identified 52 territories encompassing thousands of islands that are at risk of disappearing and vanishing if we don't address this. And again, this is just one of the many effects that if we can use and employ Ecocide, we can reduce or stop the rising sea levels and stop the vanishing of our islands. And next slide, and last and not least here, is as a nuclear engineer myself, I do believe that nuclear power does play a role in our transition, if done responsibly and correctly and with accountability. But we do have a crisis in the Pacific, and that is, of course, the disaster of Fukushima, where there's millions of gallons of highly radioactive water that may be dumped into the ocean here. And Pacific Island leaders across the board are asking for additional studies and research and what those effects are going to be. And not just putting them in there. And so this is again where we believe Ecocide, basically, this committed with knowledge, right? So we need these research to find out this knowledge, and if they find a plan and the studies that are independently verified, can put this water safely into the Pacific Ocean, I think that's something that would be amendable for everybody. But the reality is, I don't think that's the case, and that's why we need these studies. And in the event that these studies reveal what we suspect, that these highly radioactive waters will contaminate our fish and other resources, Ecocide again can be an important tool in our tool belt to protect our oceans and protect our ecosystems from a major disaster. So with that, thank you very much. Mahalo for this presentation, again, for being part of this critical conversation.
Mahalo nui loa. We are so grateful to you for bringing the linkages and also, of course, showcasing the Pacific. Now, as an economist, I have to throw a statistic out there. The IMF estimated fossil fuel subsidies at $5.9 trillion, trillion with a T, in 2020, direct and indirect. So we've actually been going the wrong way since Paris. And I loved your emphasis on the need for a moral compass in the boardroom and the fact that Ecocide can help provide that. Of course, you mentioned the importance of the precautionary principle, as did Inga, in terms of science. So thank you for that. Also, on a hopeful note, when we look at the fact that island states were the ones who, in collaboration with the B team, managed to get 1.5 degrees into the Paris Agreement, we also know that Anita Roddick's saying, if you think you're too small to make a difference, you've never been in bed with a mosquito. So just remembering the importance of the power of collaboration of small island states and the critical role already that they have been playing on the global stage. So I'd just like to finish by underscoring your approach the tribute to ancestors. And I miss Pono Shim very much too. It's so important that we as humans are good ancestors and that we think about our approach to life, not only as those who came before us, but with ourselves in that role, so we are not disadvantaging future generations. And youth are very rightly angry. So as we transition into our Q&A, I wanted to give a formal greeting in Māori from Aotearoa, New Zealand, my birthplace. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā rangatiratanga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And this formal greeting recognizes the mana, the wisdom, and the importance also of reo, te reo, the word, the importance of our conversation, and rangatiratanga, the chieftainship, the leadership. So thank you, Jojo, for your incredible leadership, all of you on the panel for yours, and to the fabulous engagement that we've been having in the chat. We're going to transition to questions, but I did just want to point out a few of the very pertinent observations in the chat for those of you who can now flick through. So Greg Dance, thank you very much for your observational comment. And Mick Haining, the read How to Be an Animal by Melanie Challenger. And Pat, important note, Wales was the first country in the world to pass a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015. So read lessons from a small country. Every piece of legislation in Wales has to have this as a core concept. Now, what if every country in the world did the same? I can tell you that in New Zealand, we now have a wellbeing budget, and that has been influenced by Wales. So let's have more of these multiplier solutions. And so we are going to transition now into our Q&A. And the first question that I wanted to ask was, Jojo, how do you see the relationship between the work that Vanuatu is doing with the International Court of Justice and the work that you are leading with Ecocide? Could you give us some background on how those two initiatives intersect?
Absolutely. So it's so important that we approach this, as Christopher actually said, from Vanuatu, with a kind of all tools, all platforms attitude. And the ICJ opinion that is being sought by Vanuatu and a growing number of countries alongside is going to be hugely important in terms of really framing what the responsibilities of states are to their citizens and to future generations in regard to climate change. So it's very much about state responsibility for the future of their citizens. With the criminal aspect, we're looking at a slightly a sort of complementary but different side. So if you like, the citizens may have a right to a future, to good health, to a clean and healthy environment, to all of those things that come under human rights. But what protects those rights is actually the criminal law sphere. So, I mean, to give a very simple example, the basic human right, of course, is the right to life. But that right is protected by the fact that to take that life away, to murder, is a crime. In other words, these are two sides of a coin, if you like. And also, I think that what we're looking at with a crime of ecocide is in large part a preventive and a deterrent aspect. Because, of course, we anticipate, we aim for this law to be at a stage of ratification within the next few years, let's say within the next 4 to 5 years. But the fact is that the impact of this conversation is already being felt now. And that is partly because we aim for an international crime and we have to gather the momentum of a lot of supporters, but it also means that people can see it coming down the line. And that means that strategic change, the window for that actually starts happening now, where policymakers and decision makers in the corporate sector can see it coming and can say, well, what actually do we need to change in order to comply with this approaching rule?
Thank you. I think that notion of deterrent is such an important one. And as John mentioned, people are going to be sitting in the boardroom actually thinking about this, providing a moral compass. So thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful clarification. Now, our audience has been voting on which questions should be answered first. So Caroline Errol, congratulations. You are number one with the most votes. The question is, isn't the Energy Charter Treaty a significant barrier in practice to criminalising ecocide? And Jojo, I'm presuming that you are the person to answer this question, but if there's any other panelists who would like to chime in after Jojo, please just give me a little wave.
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, and it's wonderful because it shows that, you know, we can talk about how criminal law is ultimately at sort of at the top of the pyramid of law, if you like. You know, ultimately it does trump trade considerations, in general principle. So, you know, a company can't, you know, sue a government if that involves, you know, if they're saying that their business model is based on something that's criminal, i.e. killing people, for example. I'm just going to take a very simple example. And so putting ecocide law in place as a criminal law will definitely intervene in this relationship, in this very problematic relationship. Exactly how that will play out in legal practice is yet to be seen. But certainly when we've consulted with our the lawyers that we work with, the response was, the lawyers are always very cautious about exact, you know, sort of making exact pronouncements about laws that are not yet in place. But what they said is, yes, it will be very relevant, and yes, it will be very interesting. And I think that that's a hugely encouraging response. I think that, you know, ecocide law will definitely have an effect on those ISDS conversations. It's going to be very important.
Thank you so much. Next question is, what role can governments of states without access to the sea play in this critical conversation? And this question is from His Excellency Milton Soto, the Ambassador of Bolivia to Sweden. So thank you very much, Excellency, for that question. And I know Antoinette, living in Switzerland, will have something to say on that. But I wondered, Antoinette, we will start with you, but is there anybody else from our panel? While Antoinette is speaking, just give me a wave and we'll give you the floor too.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that. Yes, we are all part of an ecosystem. We're all part of the planet. I am based in Switzerland, and yet here we are taking action around the world. The same thing goes for, we can refer to this, which was referred earlier, deep seabed mining. Many of the states that should actually be present and objecting to the pursuance of deep sea mining don't go or aren't involved, and we need to make sure that they are in future part of those quora. So I have found that there are many states, we're all impacted. We actually, hate to say it, we all eat fish. It all comes into our countries. There is trade involved, there's employment involved, but above all, we need to make sure that we're looking after that global resource. And right now, it's 10 nations that take 71% of the high seas catch, but that's the global commons. So we have a compelling reason to be involved. The mechanisms with which to be involved are not always that publicized, and therefore we have a civic duty to find out those mechanisms and to make sure we use them, and if they don't exist, we find ways to make them useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. Anybody else like to add to that? Thank you, Inga. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that question. Well, I mean, this is where we have to understand the role of the Arctic and the poles and why the loss of that is causality for countries globally. Julian Struve, who's a wonderful scientist, says, you know, we are all ice-dependent species. And because what happens is when we lose the Arctic and we lose the stability of the polar vortex, we start getting huge instabilities in our climate systems. So we get the droughts, unpredictability in our climate systems particularly. So we get massive droughts, we get floods, and the floods in Germany and Belgium were recently attributed in part to this, in significant part, to the loss of that and instability of the vortex. Similarly, the heat bubble that was in the States, the big freeze that we had in the UK, the big freeze of Texas, which actually it turned out to be one of the most expensive insurance incidents. So what happens then is that nations, particularly, of course, the most vulnerable, who are food dependent on their little plots, can't predict when they're going to be able to sow, and the seasonality that has been there before. So you end up with massive food insecurity. You also have what we've just had in India and Pakistan, these massive heat waves. And you know, your crops just fry, as do people. So everybody is affected. And you're asking, what can we do? Well, we're calling for all nations to participate in this moratorium, to sign up and say, we have to protect this space because it causes so much harm to so many. And if you look, I mean, nearer home to you, I mean, Venezuela, a lot of that migration that has caused so much distress and instability came from food insecurity. So it's not a huge stretch to understand the impact, but also, you know, let's all step up as stakeholders and support this moratorium and put pressure on, because we have to do this fast.
Thank you, Inga. Putting pressure on and all Arctic dependent species. Great takeaways. I have a question now from Elizabeth Boosie-Jones, and I apologize, Elizabeth, your question dropped off the list. So from a criminal lawyer's perspective, I'm concerned as to how some potential defendants may take advantage of the with knowledge element of the definition of ecocide. How is with knowledge to be defined? And can it include an obligation to conduct due diligence or make inquiries or have a reasonable belief? And then in brackets, apologies, there is an international treaty which has what I consider would be the perfect definition, but she can't find it at the moment. So Elizabeth, we do want you to forward that to us. That would be so helpful to Jojo and the team. Jojo, this is your question.
Thank you. So with the knowledge element, I think, and as with, I suppose, criminal law in a number of instances, just because the perpetrator themselves claims that they didn't have knowledge, doesn't actually sort of negate the with knowledge aspect if the knowledge is readily available in the public domain, or they should have known. In fact, the sort of default definition within the Rome Statute, aside from the individual crimes, in Article 30 specifies that the knowledge is to know or should have known. So someone in the position of commissioning or signing off on a big extractive project will obviously be expected to have known certain levels of information. So I think that it wouldn't be as problematic as your question might imply. And I think with regard to the due diligence aspect, although it wouldn't, obviously in normal course of business, anyone engaging in an extractive project or similar that is likely to cause environmental damage should in any case be engaging in due diligence. But what will be, I think, important when this law is in place is that at the moment, companies often employ expensive lawyers to work their way around regulation. In other words, to look at exactly how much, for example, of a certain toxin one might be able to release in a certain context without sort of crossing a certain line. So it can be very, very detailed and about how to kind of somehow get away with things. But when you have a law like this in place, what the aim is to have it treated almost like a criminal version of a health and safety law. And of course, let's just a simple example from health and safety. If you're building a factory, you don't start looking at how you can nearly break someone's head open, but just miss it. I mean, that's just not the approach you take. You take the approach of how do we avoid breaking someone's head open. So effectively, that's the approach. In other words, not so much about mitigating risk, but about avoiding hazard that comes in with this in place. So at that point, what we would hope is that those expensive lawyers will start doing their due diligence in the right direction. In other words, how do we avoid, creating these hazards? So yeah, thanks very much for that question.
Thank you so much. And I know we're beginning to run out of time. There's so many fantastic questions. So the next most votes was Chris Desai from the U-Ocean Project. This network of countries and legislation is a phenomenal idea, but laws are only as good as they are enforced. It feels as though we need one global authoritative organization to enforce these rules with complete jurisdiction and fully funded to be able to carry this out. Does that not sound a very sensible idea? So any panelists like to speak to that?
Jojo, you go first and I'll go after you.
Jojo, jump in. I know you're trying to give others the floor. Jump in on that one.
So just very briefly, I mean, one of the reasons we go for the ICC is that it is the only global mechanism which directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its member states because of its complementarity setup. So if you ratify a crime there, you have to include it in your own domestic legislation. So it's a sort of effective way to create a new ground rule across jurisdictions. What you can't ultimately do, though, is override national sovereign authority. So effectively, countries will still need to ratify it for it to apply within their jurisdictions. One small aspect, well, not so small in its implications, is the factor of universal jurisdiction, which is a set of principles, but whereby a country can state that a crime is serious enough that they wish to apply it regardless of whether the perpetrator or the victim comes from their country. And that could potentially also be applied here. So there is a kind of breadth to the particular route that we're pursuing.
Yeah, just to add on that is just, kind of part of it is a little bit kind of what we started presenting on and during my presentation is, there are two levels I get from critics and from enforcement that, a law is only as good as it's enforced. And so I believe, first of all, having the law in its first place, gives that level of enforcement, just being a law there. I think a lot of the people that, traditionally will do what's right in the right place will follow just the fact that law is in place and will start investing and doing the proper thing. Now, of course, there are people that can still be perpetrators. I believe that after that first enforcement action happens and there's a crime that's been committed and that company gets punitively damaged, I think that's when everything really does shift. That's where a lot of these investors that are investing in projects, they're not out there. Some of them were just underwriting these projects and looking at the risk of the projects. Believe it or not, some of them aren't really out there like trying to damage the planet. They believe they have a fiduciary responsibility and they believe they're doing exactly what is right in their responsibility, what they've been asked to do. But once you add it as a criminal enterprise, right? This project now is a criminal enterprise because it goes against Ecocide. There's a lot of investors that we're confident that would just immediately basically, move past those projects. A lot of investors are very risk averse. And I think that's what makes me so excited about Ecocide is getting those investors and people in boardrooms that the last thing they want to do is look at jail time for being a part of a criminal enterprise. And so I think, again, it's like stopping it in the very beginning before it even starts is the key.
Okay. Thank you so much. Now, I'm going to quickly run through the questions we don't have time to answer because each of our panelists is going to give one takeaway. So Greg Dance had the great suggestion of utilizing more edgy messaging towards policymakers, financiers, and political party funders. So thank you for that great suggestion. Pat Smith is talking about how we can integrate organizations united to save the planet. And Pat, there is a group called Blue Planet Alliance, which aims to do just that. So please sign on and join up. And the idea of list of links in the chat, yes, we can absolutely do that. No problem. So Sabina, you say, I can't help but feel so much of our actions add up to no more than moving chairs on the Titanic. How can Ecocide help turn this ship around? We need a paradigm shift very quickly. So Sabina, we think that is the perfect segue into our closing. And just before each of you gives a really quick 30-second takeaway, I just wanted to recognize my dear friend Rehana Robinson from Aotearoa, New Zealand in the Hauraki Gulf, just pointing out that these issues are also local issues as well. Thank you all so much for your engagement. Thank you to our brilliant panelists. And now I'm going to turn over in the same order. If you would like to give one takeaway, what would you like our audience to actually do as a result of this brilliant discussion today to create these legal guardrails and thinking about being good ancestors? Jojo, first to you.
Well, I think the key thing has to be to spread the word about this law, because we already know that when people encounter this for the first time, over 50% agree with it immediately. And what that tells us is that what this conversation needs is reach. So please tell your friends, talk about Ecocide. Just even using the word is helping that conversation move forward, and let's move those interested states up the numbers as fast as we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Spread the word. Antoinette.
It was actually just mentioned earlier, it's local, it's global. The ocean is affected, it's chemical plastic pollution, acidification, deoxidation, warming. We actually have something that is really, no one's talking about the connection to the ocean with Ecocide. I'm so glad Jojo is here. I'm so glad we're talking about this. Support, stop Ecocide, because any way, any action, Ecocide will help our actions to protect the ocean. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Antoinette. Persis. I think we may have lost Persis, so let's go straight on to Inga.
Thank you. Well, let's never forget that we are global stakeholders and that we have choices and we can make wise choices. So one of the actions we'd like people to take is to sign up as part of the Arctic Ice Force and start putting pressure on for a moratorium. So that's at state level, but individual level. And, you know, we have seen how powerful that can be with the youth movement. So don't underestimate your voice.
Don't underestimate your voice. Wonderful message. Thank you. And now moving back to Hawaii, Mana Pacific.
Aloha. Yeah, I'd like to start with just one of my, one of my favorite quotes I've read from, again, just an amazing person, is Margaret Mead. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And I think, looking through my experiences, some of the biggest things I've ever accomplished, I showed up having no idea what I was going to do or how I was going to do it. And the key is just, we have to believe that, just show up and start taking that first step, and the next step will show up, and just keeping those steps. And I promise you, just like everything's interconnected, you have the interconnectedness to bring solutions. So just show up. Thank you very much.
Perfect close. So everybody, please spread the word and support Stop Ecocide. Thank you all so much.